property owners and community decision makers. What they do is, it's us. It's a national organization, but we form a local chapter and we work on things together. So, and then it's really good because then we can ask people to guest speak, we can use resources, and it's really good. It's a great organization. You can go online and look at it and decide if you want to join, but you don't have to join. It's open to everyone that wants to participate. It says JoDaviess County, but I do have people signed up here from Dubuque. I've had people from Wisconsin interested in this, so it draws from a lot of areas. It's not a wild ones out here. The closest one is the Quad Cities. They just started one too, so they have, I can't remember, about 200 chapters now. I'm a seedling group, or we're a seedling group. That means we haven't chartered yet, we haven't been big enough. So I'd like to start a group in JoDaviess County, so if you're interested, let me know. We partner with other organizations. We've had JoDaviess County JDC up to come in. I'm part of the Northern Illinois Prairie Enthusiasts. I've talked to them about guest speakers, and they're excited about this. What Wild Ones could look like, here's some of the ideas that Wild Ones has, and I've seen this incorporated in other chapters. We work together as local members to invite guest speakers, Emily, on subjects that work for JoDaviess County and surrounding areas. Emily's actually my very first speaker, so I appreciate her. We can share expertise with members. We can get together and talk about what we know, share ideas. This is something I really like to do, is visit member gardens. We can work with local schools to support environmental education, local community members, promote healthier environments. I'd love to go to downtown Helena and see some of those huge patches of grass turned into native plants. And we can be a resource to help others establish native habitats. When I listed on the website, I got a call from the middle of Iowa asking me questions, and I'm like, whoa, I don't know resources out there. They want to know how to burn. So I referred them to another chapter, but it'd be nice if we had those resources for people. All right, if you're interested in just exploring, come on in. I could take a card, there's my cards over there. Email me, it's much better, because if I have a list, sometimes I don't get to everybody. But if you email me, you're then on my list, and we could get together and talk about things. Maybe you know somebody that you'd love to have speak, or something you're interested in. We could just have a very important group and talk about what we could do, and get this group going. All right, so let me introduce Emily. Most everyone here knows Emily. Okay, let me give you a little background. Okay, she's the this is what she sent me. I had this huge write-up, and she says, here's what I want you to say.
You can wax poet.
I think Emily is such a valuable asset to this territory.
Yeah.
Look out there. Out there, even the close by gardens, I come with my camera in the summer that's natives, and I'm like, wow, and she does such a great job of things. All right, so she's the Natural Resource Coordinator for the Galena Territory Association. She earned her degrees in botany and biological aspects of conservation from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and has been restoring habitat for more than 20 years. She lives in Shullsburg, Wisconsin with her husband, Corey Ritterbush. Yeah, everyone knows Corey, right? And her two boys, Paul and Marcus. She oversees 1,700 acres of green space in the Galena Territory, which is undeveloped woodlands and prairies. This is a little plug for the territory. 25 miles of trails, and that's what her responsibility is. So, Emily.
Thank you. Well, good morning. I will warn you that my youngest son Marcus is here, so he might be making some pop-in appearances. He's running around in the game room, I think, but don't be surprised if you see a crazy little blondie running around. Well, I'm happy to be here. Thank you all for coming this morning. We'll be talking a little bit about prescribed burns. We are entering into fall burn season, so typically there are two primary burn seasons in our area, and that is in the spring and the fall, typically starting mid to late October, but mostly I think of fall burn season as coming into November when vegetation's dormant, the leaves have fallen off the trees, giving fuel on the ground for the fire to carry through. So this is kind of a timely presentation for that season. Mary, thanks for the nice introduction. These are just a few of the pictures from my work here in the territory. I take care of a handful of park areas that we have. We have a historic cemetery on site that I take care of. I do plant surveys, woodland management, prairie restoration, invasive species management. I'm also commonly known as the tree lady, so any tree-related questions that our owners have. Of course, we have a tree cutting approval process here, and I advise our owners about how all of that works. As Mary said, we have over 25 miles of trails that I oversee, and I work very closely with our maintenance department to keep those mowed and well maintained. I lead nature trail hikes. We have a farmer's market that is our green space advisory group runs, and I oversee that, as well as a household hazardous waste, electronic collection. So all hopefully being pointing to being good environmental stewards. And then we also have a deer population control program here, which I oversee and administer and work closely with the DNR. Historically, the dominant plant communities in the Midwest, and particularly this upper Midwest area, northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, was dominated by a few different plant communities. One is prairie, our oak savannas, so there's kind of a continuum between prairie and our more heavily wooded areas, and the savanna ecosystem is kind of in the middle of that continuum. So there's varying definitions on the number of trees per acre, where something's considered no longer considered a prairie and is considered a savanna, and continues on into woodland settings. And our open oak woodlands. So historically, our woodlands would have been open, kind of much more park-like than the current condition. And a lot of that was driven by Native American use of fire on the landscape, which is what we'll continue to talk about here. The tallgrass prairie and oak woodland region, you can see, covers a lot of the eastern Midwest. I know I've seen the Midwest, of course, stretch into the Dakotas and Nebraska, but kind of our section of the Midwest there, you can see the darker gray color is the tallgrass savanna and open oak woodland areas, and then the tan would be the tallgrass prairie ecoregion. So you can see that most of Illinois was covered by prairie, and then a little bit into the mixed prairie and woodland areas here to the north and south. This is called, part of this is the Prairie Peninsula, or the Prairie Wedge, as it's called. I thought this was a great graphic from WGN TV from quite a while ago, but this kind of explains why we have this prairie grass region, and it's because of the amount of rainfall that we have here, or precipitation, I should say, because this graphic shows into northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin, more winter snowfall, so there's more precipitation that can melt into the ground, which is better for tree growth. And same thing down here on our southern edge, more rainfall in the summer and winter, and that goes into southern Illinois, Missouri, and Kentucky, Tennessee there. And so we have kind of the perfect climate for these deep-rooted prairie grasses to grow and thrive here in the Midwest. As I mentioned, a lot of the vegetation has remained here because of human influence on our ecosystems. The last glaciers in the area, of course not in the driftless region, but in the greater Midwest area, retreated around 13,000 BC. Then Native Americans started moving in shortly thereafter, followed quite a long ways later with European settlement beginning right around the turn of the 1800s. Native Americans therefore controlled the landscape for about 12,000 years, and those of us who are European descent have only been here a mere 220.
Boy, look what we've done. We should be proud of ourselves.
So historically, the fires that would have occurred on the landscape were of massive scale. So, if you're thinking of burns that are done today, our habitat has become extremely fragmented, and so a lot of our burns are done on a much smaller scale today than what would have occurred historically. So you would have had these wide expanses of prairie and woodlands that would have burned frequently. Historically, fires were caused by lightning strikes, a little less frequently by locomotives. Sparks would fly out of the engine on the old coal-fired locomotives. But then the main influence, as I said earlier, were the Native Americans here. They would start fires for several different reasons: to clear ground for hunting, for crop management, so increase of berry and nut and seed production, insect collection. A lot of entomophagy was occurring back then, where people would be eating the insects, not just relying on animal protein for nutrition. For pest management, like I said, improve growth and yields. To fireproof areas. So frequent fire would reduce the amount of fuel that was available during the next fire season. So it just would reduce the intensity of future fires if they weren't intentionally started by the Native Americans, like a lightning strike fire, or something from another area would come across, and so then that would kind of reduce the amount of fuel and the risk for large-scale fires that would be damaging or potentially fatal for them. For warfare and signaling, clearing areas for travel, felling trees, and clearing riparian areas. One result of these landscape scale fires, and we do see these in kind of a micro scale in the burns that we do today, and I'll talk about that later, are these fire shadows that were created. So, of course, our prevailing winds are westerly as they move across the landscape, and so often as burns would move from west to east, if they encountered a body of water, like this river here, Indian Creek, that would potentially stop a fire from jumping over. So you'd have these unburned areas on the east side of creeks often, and that's where your tree growth would occur, and so those would be more rich woodlands with more varied tree species and things than like what you'd find in the prairie, which would be the fire-resistant oak trees. So all of this led to our area, and I do have a map of Illinois I'll show later as well, but I thought this really showed nicely a little more color gradient than the Illinois maps I could find of what we have here in the southern Wisconsin, and would be applicable to northern Illinois as well. So the dark green here is oak openings. That would include bur oaks, white oaks, black oaks. The gold would be oak stands, open oak stands that were dominated, again, white oak, black oak, bur oak. In our area we have more red oak and red oak, northern pin oak, and things like that. The white is the prairie areas. So you can see we're really dominated by quite a few trees, but again, these would have been very open areas and not these densely wooded conditions that we might be more familiar with, like in northern Wisconsin. You can really see how that changes based on the snowfall and the amount of precipitation they get in the winter. So as settlers came in, European settlers began a series of fire suppression activities, and one of that is largely due to development. So Native Americans were a little bit more nomadic, and they would move with the seasons, and they didn't have these very well established cities with a lot of wooden structures, and so you can see how this would be a dangerous situation if fire were to escape and come into a city. You can think of something like the Great Chicago Fire, where it could be really devastating to a metropolis urban area. Another reason for fire suppression was just land use changes, such as breaking the prairie. So here you have a couple images of oxen team being used to turn the prairie, and then an early sketch of a prairie plow. I thought this was an interesting quote from Bill McLean. He's a botanist at the Illinois State Museum and has done a lot of studies over the years of fire frequency, and he reads tree rings and things to see when fire scars would have occurred, and then that kind of they have been able to study how often fire was used, how intense fires were historically. But he, here in this paper, was talking about the settlers coming in, and fire became less desirable. Settlers set out to eliminate wildfire. It was not an easy task because they were started by lightning, sparks from chimneys, muzzle loaders, trains. Settlers combated the destruction by plowing fire breaks around homes and crops. They burned prairies in late spring to reduce fire danger in fall. So again, that's similar to what the Native Americans were doing to reduce the intensity there. They threw into prairies the seeds of cool season exotic grasses, which produce less fuel and burn less readily. So you can think of our pasture grasses, the brome grasses that we see out today, dominated by cool season grasses, which of course green up earlier in the spring than our native prairie plants, and would just be harder to burn, or fires would be less intense than with that green fuel. They organized firefighting brigades, plowed the prairie. Fire was still used as an agricultural tool, and fire along railroad tracks were burned to reduce brush. But for the most part, fire suppression was a cultural norm, and was aided by the construction of de facto fire breaks, roads, plowed lands, and grazed pastures. So again, getting into that habitat fragmentation. One kind of neat thing about the railroads is this says they did burn along the railroads to keep them free of brush for better travel across the country. And you can see a lot of prairie remnants along old railroad beds and grades still today. So it's a neat thing to still be able to encounter as a result of that. Unfortunately now, a lot of the train companies have moved to using herbicide to maintain their rights of way. So some of that diversity is being lost. It still happens. So these are just some examples of some early fire suppression. So this would have been a team of people. If this field had caught on fire, they're just trying to beat that back as any means possible. So I think they're having gunny sacks and burlap bags, and you can see this guy has like a switch that he's using just to try to tamp out that fire. This is a civilian conservation corps fire suppression crew that would have worked in our in the early national forests. This picture is from 1937. One cool thing about this is that they are holding a lot of the tools that we still use today for wildland firefighting and for our prescribed burn applications. So for example, this is called a Pulaski rake, and it has big teeth on it that are like cutting teeth, so you can cut vegetation, small brushy vegetation, grassy vegetation to help clear a fire break, or mostly for clearing fire breaks. A regular old leaf rake, this specialized tool is called a McLeod. And again, you can use it to rake vegetation or to tamp fires. So it's got a pretty big base to it. It can be used to tamp out smaller fires. And then, an axe, which is more appropriate for woodland fire settings. But kind of neat that some of the tools that are still used today, were around in 1937 with the CCC. So fire suppression, kind of the nail in the coffin in the United States, northern United States, was Smokey the Bear. And it was a campaign created by the Forest Service and the Ad Council, and he was started in 1944. This is actually the original poster that was created for Smokey the Bear, and created over time the perspective that all fire is bad. And now we have learned in the decades since that pretty much the whole country has thrived on fire, and the lack of fire in all these areas have led to the massive wildfires that we see today, coupled with a lot of other things such as climate change, increase in development on the edge of the wilderness. But it led to decades of fire cessation, which again gave it that perspective that fire was bad, so that when fires did start, the rush was on to just get it under control as quickly as possible, instead of letting areas safely burn. So, and even still today, more than 80% of all wildfires are caused by human activity. So campfires getting away, fireworks getting away, horrible baby reveal accidents, gender reveal accidents. I think there were a couple of texts from that. And, so that was, it's, even though this campaign has been going on for 70 plus years, it's still, humans are the #1 cause of wildfires still today. So there was some good news still coming out of the early 1900s. The first prairie restoration occurred at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, started in 1936 at what's now the UW Arboretum. You can still see that today it's actively managed. It's called the Curtis Prairie, and founded by Alda Leopold, of course, and then John T. Curtis was an ecologist and botanist from UW-Madison, did classic Wisconsin, vegetation of Wisconsin surveys that now is kind of the benchmark to which all current and future vegetative studies are compared to see how areas have changed and plant communities have changed over time. But thanks to the Arboretum website, I found this cool photo of a early burn of Curtis Prairie from 1940 to 1945. I'm really glad I don't have to burn prairies in a dress. I don't know how. That had to be hot and uncomfortable. There's a lot of activities from this fire where you see women trekking in dresses, and I don't know how they did it.
And without high heels.
Yeah. So fire has slowly made a comeback on the landscape and is coming around in public perception. From the 1960s to the 1980s, botanists and ecologists kind of became arsonists and would set areas on fire on the sly. I even saw that happening when I worked in the Chicagoland area. There were areas that burned that you have no idea how they started, like around the Indiana Dunes, the early 90s, late 90s, and everyone kind of in the industry thought that it was probably someone that knew this needed to burn and might have flicked a match in there, or somehow I had a boss who would take ping pong balls and put some chemical compounds in there and say he was gonna just arson prairies all over the place. I don't think he ever did, but he was crazy enough to do it. And the North American Prairie Conference started in 1968, and it was started by these are three famous botanists from Wisconsin, Illinois, Norman Fassett, Pete Schramm from the Galesburg area and Robert Betts. And so even in their proceedings from that 1968 conference kind of talked about burning prairies and how they could accomplish that more. So there's some questioning of the Smokey the Bear campaign starting to emerge at that time as well. Of course, in 1988, we had the huge tragedy of the massive wildfire in Yellowstone that everyone thought was just, a devastating loss for the whole park and that area. However, we learned over time that the vegetation did come back. It came back healthier. There was a huge diversity of plant life that returned that had been kind of hiding under the soil because it had gotten so overgrown. And with that land clearing presence of the fire, so those species were able to emerge again. And fire became more widely used in our natural areas, 1990s to 2000s through today. In 2007, the state of Illinois passed the Illinois Prescribed Burning Act. And this basically said that the legislature agreed that fire was good for our natural communities. It was a useful land management tool that benefits this top paragraph here, safety of the public, the environment, and the economy of the state. And then they went on to list several reasons why that was the case, and it basically gave people the right to do burns on their property, on public property as well. It's very interesting to read the whole thing, and the reasons and why the legislature justified passing the Prescribed Burn Act. A little light bedtime reading for later. So now we'll get into why we burn and why we burn our native plant communities. So learn how the history of fire shaped the landscape, primarily human influenced from frequent Native American fires. And that resulted in the map on the left is the pre-settlement vegetation of Illinois from the early 1800s. This is why I used that map of Wisconsin earlier. I think it just showed the plant communities in a little bit more detail than what's shown here. But you can see again here, the green, they have labeled forest, and all the tan would be prairies, grassland areas. So again, you can see that the forests really border a lot of the rivers and things, where the wooded areas would be located, and then same thing with up in our region. And some of that has to do with the topography here, which I'll get into it a little bit as well, but the topography and how steep slopes are and the direction that they face can affect how fire travels over the landscape as well. Again, we're labeled forest, looking at the early historic accounts of the area, including the 1840s surveyor notes. A lot of the forests out here were described as open oaks, widely spaced oaks, a lot of hazelnut in the understory. Really a lot more open communities. And then this is the present day land cover of Illinois. You can really see how it's changed. We've lost almost all of our prairie. Majority of the woodlands have been plowed under, ripped out for ag, and then the yellow agriculture is what's dominant today. So some of the reasons that we burn include that these communities are really fire dependent, and that is because they have been shaped for tens of thousands of years by frequent fires on the landscape. You have your prairie and savanna situations. The burns would also help increase germination of plants, increase the number of flowers available, and that would therefore increase the amount of seed production. Burning also helps cycle nutrients, and some of the nutrients that are found in ash at the end of a burn include calcium, potassium, phosphorus, and magnesium, and these are all micronutrients that are typically available in the soil, but these burns and the addition of that ash into the soil complex again really helps maintain the healthy soil regime in our area. Burning also helps increase soil temperature and the number of degree days, so it increases the growing season for warm season grasses, and it decreases the cool season. And that is because this is a burn that was done just next door here earlier this spring. And you can see the end result after the burn is all said and done is that the ground is charred and black, and that really, of course, darker surfaces absorb the sun and heat up more quickly. And so that's why you get more of these warm season grasses and plants growing and dominating these areas. Prescribed burn also helps with invasive species management. And so again, I had mentioned the fire shadow before, so this is kind of a micro scale of that fire shadow, where you can see the fire would have been moving, across the landscape in this direction, and then it encountered this log that was on the ground, and then that created enough of a break to stop that fire. So you can see in the foreground here, this had all been burned, but in the background, the fire missed this area. And this is actually all garlic mustard that's starting to come up here. So you can imagine, that's probably what this lower half of the picture would have also looked like. I mean, here you do see still a little bit of garlic mustard, but garlic mustard is a species that is very fire sensitive. And so woodland burns really do help reduce the amount of garlic mustard in an area. Burning also helps remove or reduce woody debris, particularly important in our woodlands, and it will help over time reduce the intensity, recycles those nutrients a little bit faster that are bound up in the wood material. And just kind of cleans the forest floor up from tree falls, wind throws, things like that. Other reasons to burn include stressing woody plants and non-native species, most invasive plants. So this image here is in a woodland setting, and a fire is slowly burning through. This is a honeysuckle shrub, and so it's slowly burning through that shrub, and it will end up top killing that. So again, it won't kill it outright because the roots are really persistent, but it really helps reduce the amount of these invasive species that are in our woodlands. It allows more sun to the ground, which can help with germination. Again, control woody invasion. So without fire, a lot of our open areas go through early successional changes through the introduction of eastern red cedar, box elder trees that are not very fire tolerant. And so the frequent fires over time helped keep those things out of our prairies and kept them open. And then it also can decrease the amount of duff or plant material on the ground where ticks like to overwinter. So burning in our woodlands can help reduce tick populations. It's also been found that ticks favor woodlands that have a lot of honeysuckle, Japanese barberry, because they can change the microclimate of the area close to the soil. It makes it more humid with those species present, and that's really, ticks thrive in that kind of environment. And therefore burning that off can not only kill the ticks that are overwintering in that duff, but also top kill those plants to reduce the amount of plants that are in the woodland that create a favorable tick habitat. So now we'll get into a little bit of how to burn, and this is a very simplified version of a burn unit. But some of the things that we consider when we're burning include weather, including wind direction, humidity, and then where we create our breaks and start our fire is based on those main components in order to safely apply fire to our target area. So the first aspect of that would be to create a burn plan, and this is something that we have to do for all of our sites here. If you hire someone to do a burn of your property, this is also what you can expect that they will do. You know, if I'm burning a little prairie that's like the size of these 4 tables pushed together, or something that just a little island in my yard, of course I don't have to go. I don't have to go through this whole step. I mean, that's a different. You know, if you're just a landscape bed or something. But it's still important, even on those small scales, to understand how wind and weather can affect your burn. We will get into that. But the aspects of the burn plan include a description of the burn site, number of acres, the fuel types that you're burning, so if it's oak leaf litter, tall grass prairie, short grass prairie, the reason why you're burning. So if I do a fall burn, I might be preparing that site to seed it over the winter, or do clear it so I can get into a woodland to better manage vegetation over the course of the year, just kind of clear some of the duff out of the way. The burn preparation that's needed, the type of fire breaks that you have, who needs to be notified, so neighbors, here in the territory, we notify security, and then the sheriff's dispatch. Then you get more into your prescription with what type of weather that you want for your burn. That includes wind speed, temperature, relative humidity, the type of equipment that you'll need on site, the desired timing. So will you be burning in the fall? Will you be burning early in the spring, later in the spring, to maybe stress some of those cool season grasses, and then important contact information, including, of course, emergency numbers and the numbers of neighbors. So then that is combined with a site map, and that on the map then is what shows where your burn breaks are, your expected or prescribed wind direction, your ignition sequence, and any potential hazards. So again, this is the prairie next door to the Owners Club here. For this burn, we were hoping for a northerly, a wind out of the south, a southerly wind. Here in the territory, we have to keep in mind that we have a lot of houses next door to our burn units, so we try to reduce the amount of smoke that goes towards houses as much as possible. And then just how we anticipate burning. So with the wind from the south, we start on the north edge and then slowly work our way around. And there is a big pond in the middle of this area, so we would burn this north unit off first by going around the pond and the wet area, and then come through and burn the southern half. And your firing or ignition sequence would change then based on your wind direction. So if we had a wind out of the east, then we'd want to start along this western edge of the unit. So as I mentioned, it's important to know your adjacent land use when burning. So here, this is Buehler Preserve in Galena, a property of the JoDaviess Conservation Foundation. So some of the adjacent land, we have the city of Galena, a low-density urban area to the northwest, a park area, and then this is all farmland here. So probably, and then another consideration are your roads, to reduce the amount of smoke that goes over that can cause traffic obstructions or problems. So probably the desired wind direction for this unit would be west, northwest, to take our smoke across the farmland areas here to affect the fewest number of people. You probably get away with the north wind as well, so there's not much going on down here to the south. Powderhouse Hill Road is far enough away that that wouldn't be a consideration. So as I mentioned, smoke management is important. Burns are smoky, so these are just a few examples of what some of the smoke columns can look like. Here there wasn't a lot of wind, so you can see that smoke is kind of thick and heavy, and it's not really being carried away from the site very quickly. Again, this is a later spring prairie burn, so some of the prairie areas would have been greening up a little bit. Of course, when you burn green things, you create a lot more smoke than when you burn dry things. And so, but again, now we have a wind direction from right to left in this photo, and so you can see the smoke moving away from the edge of the unit. And then this is a nice smoke column where the smoke is rising pretty much straight up into the atmosphere, and then those upper winds will take that smoke away. So something like this, you don't want to burn on a perfectly calm day, because then you can get a situation where the smoke just kind of lingers. But you know, some lighter winds, 10 miles an hour, are pretty good and will help create a nice smoke column where then the smoke gets high enough in the atmosphere and is blown away, that it doesn't affect someone right next door to it necessarily. So timing of when to burn. Again, our fuel types here, primarily prairies and oak-dominated woodlands. A lot of some of our mixed stand woodlands that might include maple trees or basswood trees. Those are really great to burn in the fall. Once the snow and precipitation has sat on the leaf litter on the ground for those species, a lot of times they'll just kind of mat them down. And so if you're trying to burn something with maple in it, or you know, it just doesn't dry out nicely in the spring to be able to carry a fire. So you know, it's really driven by your fuel types on when you will burn. Prairies, they can burn in the fall or the spring. Rarely there's occasional summer burns, and that's sometimes depending on really targeting a specific goal. But that would be like a late summer, you know, August, September time frame. But typically the windows, as I mentioned at the start, are either in the spring or the fall. Plant management, so do you have plants that you're trying to stress, like these garlic mustard seedlings in this photo, plants that you're trying to promote, wildlife management considerations, you know, are the frogs present and potentially out that you, or reptiles that you don't want to damage or kill, weather. Of course, you're looking at, again, wind direction, wind speed, and humidity. Humidity is actually a really important component of this. If you burn on a day that's too humid, your fuels, your fine fuels such as your grasses and like leaf litter will absorb that humidity and are less likely to burn on days that it's more humid. Or you can have a lower fire intensity, and perhaps that is also your goal. So you want to try to burn on a more humid day. If you want kind of a patchier fire that will maybe allow for more duff or leaf litter to survive, you know, and which is a benefit because there's insects that overwinter in plant stems or cocoons in leaf litter, things like that. So you might want a lower intensity burn instead of just making everything black. Slope and aspect, so how steep your slope is and the direction that it faces. The day of the week, that's a consideration for us here in the territory. We, of course, are a vacation community, and you know, same thing even with Galena, with the amount of visitors that come regularly on the weekends. I know working with JoDaviess Conservation Foundation on some of their burn sites, they try to avoid burning on the weekends just because they don't want that smoke and kind of commotion and everything to be occurring when there's a greater number of people in the area. And then fuel moisture content for some of the bigger, like coarse woody debris or thicker plant stems, things like that. I'll get into these a little bit more. So the timing wise on the slope and aspect, so this is looking down a valley, and the slope to the right is a north facing slope, and the slope to the left is a south facing slope. So with how the sun hits our area here, our south facing slopes will warm up sooner than the north facing slopes. They just don't have as much sunlight and solar radiation hitting them. So this is a great example of that as the snow melts, so it'll melt faster on a south-facing exposure. And same thing, a lot of times plants will bloom earlier on a south-facing slope, and then you'll see that same plant maybe blooming a couple of weeks later on the north-facing slope, just because it takes longer for those soil temperatures to warm up for the plants to grow. Again, this can get into the types of vegetation that are present. So typically south-facing slopes are more dry, and so you'll have more prairie component or a dry to dry music woodland, whereas our north-facing slopes will have more rich soils or more moist soils, and then you get more fire intolerant species that will grow there. So on our north facing slopes here is where we can find our maple trees typically, historically, more red oaks and basswoods that would be a little bit more sensitive to having fire come through. And that's because they have, they have thinner bark so that they can be top killed or damaged more easily from the heat from the fire. Timing, this is a fuel moisture map from just yesterday. So these are 10-hour fuels, and we have several different fuel classes. So we have 1-hour fuels, which I mentioned the picture of the leaf litter earlier. So those are our fine fuels, the grasses, our forbs, and the leaf litter that will, so basically the 1 hour is the amount of time it will take for that fuel to dry out sufficiently to carry a fire. And you can actually, it's pretty cool with leaves, oak leaves, to watch those. They curl up nicely, which is why that makes them such good fuel. So you can see here, as you're looking at these oak leaves, and they're not all just perfectly flat and matted down. They curl and they kind of sit on top of each other nicely and create little pockets for air, which is what makes that a good fuel for burning. But you can actually watch the change in the fuel moisture when looking at oak leaves, because in the morning, if it's dewy or something, your oak leaf might lie a little bit flatter, and then as it dries out during the day, it will start, those lobes of that leaf will start kind of curling and giving it more of that three-dimensional characteristic that's good for carrying fire. The next level of fuels are the 10-hour fuels, and these are like the small woody fuels, twigs, things like that, that would potentially take 10 hours to dry out and go from wet to burnable. And then you get into your bigger fuels, 100-hour and 1,000-hour fuels. So 1,000-hour fuels, might be a huge tree trunk that's out in the middle of the woods, and then 100-hour, slightly smaller. So what we are looking at is kind of our 10-hour fuel moisture as a gauge for how burnable a site potentially is. And that's because when we're burning our woodlands, we do want some of that fine woody material to be consumed with the fire. Sometimes you're also want larger stuff to burn. You'll look at your 100-hour fuel maps and see if you have a big tree that you really want consumed on a site. You can target a burn on that site when your 100-hour fuel moisture levels are lower. So our fuel type differences here and how they affect the fire. On the left is an oak woodland, and you can see the flame height is pretty small. In our wooded situations, there's not a lot of fuel to be consumed, it's short statured, versus on the right is a tall grass prairie, so you can get some pretty good flame lengths, especially when you're looking at a head fire, which is what's happening on this left side of the photo, where the head fire is the fire that is being pushed by the wind. So the wind is driving that and causing it to burn that fuel faster, creating larger flame lengths, versus especially what we have in our woodland settings are typically considered more low-key, I guess, types of situations for burning. So knowing what your fuel type is then allows you to know how to effectively do some site prep. So one extremely important feature is our burn breaks. And we have existing burn breaks using existing features such as this driveway. You can use creeks, trails, even like ravine bottoms can potentially be used as a burn break. And then otherwise you want to blow or rake a burn break. And here, this is in a woodland setting. Burn breaks can be slightly smaller in the woods because of that lower flame length in the picture I showed you earlier. I find that a leaf blower is the most effective tool for creating fire breaks in a woodland area. Sometimes you have to go through and maybe cut some woody debris up that might be over where your you want your break to go, but largely you can get away with getting a really great break down to the bare soil with a leaf blower. This is into mowed trails or lawn areas make great burn breaks. So you can see, these are both mowed trails for these prairie areas. There's a big difference in timing. So this is a little later in the spring, or maybe after a warmer spring when things have really greened up very well. So this fire break here is nice and green, and it will not, the fire will not carry through that as readily as like this one, which has been mowed and maintained quite well. But it's still early in the spring, so it's still very brown. So the fire could kind of slowly creep through this. You have a little bit of, off-target vegetation, flammable vegetation that's adjacent to your break. And so what this crew is doing here is using the ATV with water in it to lay down some water on that area as the ignition specialist is lighting this vegetation. So that will prevent the fire from creeping through the drier vegetation there. Other things to consider when doing site prep, potential hazards, fences. Like this particular fence is an old wooden fence. Those logs or those posts would be pretty flammable. They look pretty nicely aged. So prepping around something like that, or maybe even just mowing a break. Instead of burning right up to the fence, mowing a break on your burn unit side of the fence to create separation there. Also, fences are a consideration if you have a fire turn on you and you need to step away from it or get into a safety zone. This can be an obstruction for that. So it's just something to know where those hazards are and if you have to do any additional prep around it. In our urban settings, utility boxes and pedestals and LP tanks are one consideration to prep around. So, raking or mowing vegetation down around those, wetting down around them, anything to keep the fire from creeping too close to that. Other potential hazards include evergreen trees. So these are a couple examples of eastern red cedar. The one on the left, it actually was our intention to burn some of the cedar trees. And they do, like I said earlier, they do encroach in the prairies. And so they are not considered really that desirable to occur in a prairie setting. I know it's a big problem in Nebraska, and a lot of land managers in Nebraska really try to use fire to their advantage to control the cedar trees from taking over the rangeland and grazing habitats there for the cattle and stuff. And so in this setting, the landowner did want to preserve some of the cedar trees, and so what was done here would be to rake vegetation around that and then wet down around the trees. So you can see how there's an unburned area at the base of this cedar tree, and that's because as this backfire was coming across here, and again, this can show the difference in fire intensity from a backfire, so where the fire is moving against the wind, and then versus a head fire where you have higher flame lengths and things. And so this burn is much less intense, and you can do some micromanaging of features in your unit to protect them from the flames. So here, as this fire would have been creeping back this way before it got too close, you know, someone would have come in with an ATV or a backpack sprayer and sprayed around the base of the tree so that fuel would have been wet when the fire came through so that it didn't start the cedar tree on fire. This is also a consideration if you're burning close to more manicured landscape areas, you know, if you have a tree planted nearby with potentially mulch around it, if you're trying to establish some oak trees adjacent to prairie, then this is something that you want to do for that situation. Other potential hazards include snags, and so these are dead or mostly dead trees in woodland settings. The one on the right here had been kind of partially uprooted and was leaning into some other trees. And again, you know, when we were prepping the fire break here, we just took some extra time with the leaf blower to blow around the base of that tree. The situation on the left, you had a partially broken and half dead tree, and some embers did end up getting up into this tree and kind of smoking. There's probably a squirrel nest up there with some leaf material in it. So this was something that at the end of the burn, we worked really hard to try to put out as much as we could so that we wouldn't lose the entire tree. But knowing that that's there, you know, you can take some different actions to maybe not light a head fire, which of course will, you know, send, as that's moving with the wind, you can get some sparks flying, which is how this snag caught on fire. But it's just something to be aware of in your burn units. I have a woodland site out here on the corner of Wachter and Territory that there are some old trees in it that have some damage at the base that are kind of starting to rot from the middle, and so I will take the time on a site like that to prep around those. Now, if this is the DNR and they're burning hundreds of acres, you can't go out and micromanage every tree on your property. So, you know, sometimes, you know, even desirable trees will catch on fire and die in situations like that. And, you know, when you're burning on a larger landscape scale like that, the loss of a handful of trees isn't as big of a deal as if it's in your backyard or the 7-acre, you know, small site that sites that we manage here in the territory. Other potential hazards include downed woody debris. So these are situations where it depends on how you can leave your site at the end of the day. So this downed hollow tree could potentially burn for several days, and that might not be a problem, and you might want that to get rid of that material. It all depends on kind of what your desires are. If you don't want to have to check on it regularly or babysit it, or if something like this would be very close to the burn break, you would not want this thing to catch on fire like this. Because it would be something that you'd either have to try to put out or cut up and move further into the burn unit. Excuse me. But other times it's okay to just let these things burn and let the fire consume that. Oh, pardon me, I have to take a drink here. And again, same thing with your downed woody debris. So here on the left, you can see that, part of a top of a tree fell and it's leaning against, this looks like it's an elm tree, this elm tree. And so as this burns, because it's laying right against that trunk, it's also burning up the standing tree. So again, if this is something that you are micromanaging on your own site or a smaller site, or if this is an extremely desirable oak tree or something, you'd want to pull that woody debris away from the base of that tree so that it doesn't end up burning it like that. A burn scar like that on a tree could potentially be deadly for that tree. Other potential hazards include slop over, so that is a fire edge that crosses a line intended to control the fire. And there's a little bit of an example of this on the left. So this is our burn break here. And again, you can see that it's still very dry. It's similar in color to the adjacent vegetation of the prairie that we're trying to burn. And then this is how, that fire is just kind of slowly creeping its way back into that burn break. And then over here is adjacent flammable vegetation again, which is not our target burn site. So this slop over is something, you keep a very close eye on. Your fire crew will tamp that out either using like a flapper or potentially a rake or some water to prevent that fire from creeping into your off-target unit there. Electrical lines and poles is a consideration if you have a lot of heavy smoke that hits a power line, it can cause that to arc and cause a spark to hit the ground. So if you're burning under electrical lines, it's a good idea to try to get that fire to move quickly underneath those and across that area. Luckily out here, most of our power lines are buried, so that's not an issue that we face. But in the countryside, that would potentially be something to consider. Volatile fuels can just burn a lot hotter. They have resins and oils and things in them that just makes a fire go through there a lot more intensely. So cattails are an example, switchgrass, and then this photo is of Phragmites, an invasive wetland grass that fortunately is not very prevalent out here in JoDaviess County, but it is a big consideration back in the Chicagoland area where it occurs pretty regularly. So when you're creating your fire breaks, kind of a rule of thumb is to create it as 1.5 times as wide as your anticipated flame height. Typically in a prairie area, prairie setting, that would be 8 to 10 feet wide. Shortgrass prairie you can get away with a little bit narrower, and then in a woodland, 3 to 4 feet wide is typically a pretty good break in a wooded setting. Utilize existing features where you can. I mean, it can be a lot of work to cut in a fire break or mow one in. So if you can use something like a creek or driveway, that's recommended. And then they can also be multi-purpose. So we had talked about our trails, and oftentimes here in the territory, and I know like the JoDaviess Conservation Foundation, properties will utilize their trail system to subdivide their sites into different burn units. Okay, so we've done our site prep, we've written our burn plan, we've considered the hazards, the weather, what our goals and objectives are. So we're finally ready to burn. So one thing that is important for safety reasons is our personal protective equipment. So typically, we wear a helmet with a face shield. Our hair would be either pulled back or protected. Typically I wear a bandana over my hair because I have singed it before. And eye protection is important. Nomex shirt and pants, or some sort of fire retardant clothing, and that's what's shown here. They have full jumpsuits that are Nomex, as well as the separate pant and shirts as what's shown. Leather gloves, cotton clothes layered, or natural fiber clothes layered under your Nomex, so you don't want to be wearing your lycra sweatpants under the Nomex, or any polyester. The fleece jackets are not good to wear on burns because, of course, they're made of recycled plastic in a lot of cases, and they can melt in fires. So, denim jeans, cotton, several layers of cotton shirts are a good idea. And then leather boots. So, you're really trying to get the fire resistant clothing layered on there. So once everyone has their PPE on and you meet on site, you go over your go, no-go checklist. Do you have any required permits in hand? There are some fire districts that do require permits. Once you start approaching the Wisconsin River, in Wisconsin, you have to get permits from the DNR in order to do any prescribed burns in that area, because wildfires and escapes are a little bit more common in that area due to the terrain, which is a little bit more steep and extreme than what we have here in the southern driftless. Is your whole crew there? Everyone that you need to safely do the burn? Your equipment is all accounted for, it's all working correctly. The worst thing that could happen would be you need a water and all of a sudden your pump's not working, and now what do you do? So you want to make sure all your equipment is in good working order. Any special precautions have been taken. Your burn brakes are inspected so you know what kind of condition that they are in. If there's any wet lining that you need to do, or areas that are a little brushier that you might need to take a little bit more time to burn through. The crew has been briefed so they know what the objectives are, your plan for the burn, how you're going to execute that. We talked about the ignition order earlier when we looked at the map, so that everyone's on the same page. So a lot of times you'll label those. Everyone's got radios, and you'll say, hey, Corey, you walk over to point B, and once you and I are both at point B, we'll round the corner, and so everyone can stay coordinated that way. So you go over your plan and including contingencies if something goes wrong, how you're going to react, and then all of your third-party notifications have been made. So the neighbors know what's going on. You call the sheriff's office dispatch to let them know, and then it's time to go. So there's several different ignition methods. One is a backfire, which is what's shown here in this photo. And again, you can see the wind. So this is the edge of the unit, and the wind is moving from right to left in this photo. And so you're gonna start your burn against the wind, and it'll cause that to burn more slowly into your target vegetation. Few other types of fire include a flanking fire, which is, for example here, this is my husband Corey, if he were to cut perpendicular or walk into the wind along a pretend burn break right here, that burn on the side of the unit that's kind of going in, I guess, what is that, parallel with the wind, would be considered the flanking fire. And then your head fire, which is the one that's pushed by the wind. Spot firing is one method of lighting head fires, where you just, instead of putting a big line of fire down, you just put a little bit here, skip an area, put a little bit later, and that can kind of cause an irregular burn pattern to create refugia. And refugia is just places of unburned vegetation where insects and animals and things can stay safe in a burn. So again, this goes over the execution and how a burn would work. So again, you will start against the wind with your backfire, and you create what's referred to as the black line. And so basically that's a zone of already burned vegetation where you're not going to get a slap over or fire to reoccur in that area. The fire up the edge here would be considered the flanking fire, and then they felt that this black line was big enough and safe enough that they could start head fires here. And so again, that's the fire that's pushed with the wind, and this is using that spot fire technique. So you put down a little bit of fire here, walked a bit, and then walked a bit again to continue putting that down.
Excuse me, the wind is blowing from left to right on this one?
Yeah, so, yep, yeah, there is an arrow
Oh, I
here
see.
that says a wind direction that's, yes, that's correct. So some real life examples of what these types of fires look like. So this is a backing fire. This is up here at the corner of Territory and Marina Drives, what we refer to as Big Rock Prairie. And so in this case, the wind is coming primarily from the north, because this is the south edge of the unit. And so this would be the backfire coming across, and then this would be the black line. The crew is working down here on a trail that we have at the base of the hill, and then I was just up on the hill kind of taking a bit more of a bird's eye view of the fire taking shape.
It is one steep trail.
Yeah.
We found that out.
Yep. And this is a nice example of the flanking fire. So this fire then, once we felt the black line was safe, we turned the corner and came along the side of the burn unit. And so you get a little bit more flame intensity here, because as it burns in, it does start pushing a little bit of head fire towards your black line. But it's still, a pretty low intensity burn. And then once you find or you feel that everything is safe, you can go ahead and light a head fire to finish off the burn. Again, head fires don't always have to be used. The backfires are, these are a little higher intensity. Your burn might be slightly patchier. With a head fire, with a backfire, you don't consume as many coarse stems, so you could still have some insect refugia and some unburned stems. With a backing fire, since the fire is creeping against the wind a little bit more slowly, this is especially good in a woodland setting. You get a longer what's called residency time, where that heat and flame is on something like that honeysuckle I had showed earlier, and that can more effectively top kill some of your brushier vegetation. So if your fire is carrying through and you have light brush in an area, that is a nice way to top kill those plants a little bit more effectively, versus a head fire can move through pretty quickly and it might not cause some of that woody vegetation to die just because the heat is not on the plant long enough to kill it. This is an example of refugia. This was purposefully created, of course, around the bluebird box. But there are, as I've mentioned, there are ways to create some refugia just by your ignition patterns. There's a lot more burn rotations going on, whereas opposed to for example, the Pond Court site, or the Callahan Prairie site next door, there's kind of a north unit and a south unit. So instead of burning the entire site, this last year, we left the south unit to be that insect refugia, that then those insects could more readily repopulate the area of burned prairie. So depending on how big your site is and your site characteristics, if you can burn a third of your prairie every year in a rotation, that allows then insects or things that species that like the unburned areas versus freshly burned areas to, you know, have the greatest amount of insect diversity in your burn units and habitat. So after ignition, in the middle of the burn, it's really important to stay coordinated with your burn team or crew. So we use radios, relay persons, spotter or PR person. That's really more for like large scale burns or like park district scale size burns where you might have more public interface with something like that. Always want to keep an eye on the weather. Know what your forecast is for the day, if there's any predicted wind shifts or changes. If you're lucky enough to have a big enough crew, you can have a burn boss that just kind of roams and oversees everybody. And then one really important part of fire is always have LCES. So you have lookouts, good communication, you know your escape routes, and safety zones if something were to go horribly wrong. So middle stages, some things to be aware of during a burn. This is called a fire tornado, and they are caused by changes in temperature and with wind and topography, and they can cause these fire devils or whirls. And sometimes they can kind of start moving on their own through a burn unit, and so you have to be careful if your unit is a large enough scale, could it hop over a burn break? And this would be an instance where you'd really want to slow down your ignitions and just kind of like let this play out and see what happens. This is a really small scale one, so so you can actually just kind of enjoy and appreciate how cool it looks. Is your smoke negatively impacting something, a neighbor, someone? So in this case, smoke was blowing across the road, so they this crew positioned an ATV along the road for oncoming traffic, so they would know that, you know, not to worry, this has been intentionally set, and just to, you know, let people know that they should be slowing down as they go through that. Another thing that is a potential concern are wind shifts, and I do know that there was a wind shift on this particular unit that was unexpected, and so the crew immediately stopped lighting the backfire, turned into a head fire, and they had to quickly then run to where the head fire would have been lit from. So for example, if the fire would have been started along this line here and was backing into this area and had a sudden wind shift where suddenly then this fire became a head fire and was starting to push this direction, then the crew stopped their ignitions and started a fire on this side. So if the wind shifted again, then those two fires could burn themselves together. But that's much better than that going unmitigated into the woodland area there. So again, I mean, if anyone's doing a backyard prairie burn or something like that, this isn't probably something that you will encounter. This is something that's a consideration on larger scale units to worry about. And oftentimes at the end of the burn, you'll end with a ring fire. So as you continue to burn around the perimeter, you end up ringing your whole unit. And it will, as the fire becomes closer to itself, it kind of draws all the air in and will cause all the flame to kind of meet in the middle and send up a big smoke column. So I have a couple other pictures of that. So that's shortly after this unit was rung, and then as that fire really came together. So you can see this is where you get also your most intense flame heights as all that heat and everything. And one last burst, so your smoke column going straight up in the air for better dispersal. And that's a good picture of a smoke column at the end of a ring fire. So the take-home messages here is that burning is about 75% planning and 25% execution. It's really important to be very familiar and know your site well, be respectful of your neighbors and how they might be impacted, especially by the smoke. Be prepared for any kind of changes, a jump on the fire break, what your contingency plan is going to be, and definitely don't underestimate the fire. They are obviously very dangerous. People have died. I mean, Aldo Leopold died during a burn on his own property in central Wisconsin. So just don't underestimate the force of what you're putting on the ground. And with that, I will entertain any questions.
Have you ever had a fire reignite when you thought it was completely burned out?
No, it would just be like in a woodland setting if the woody debris would continue burning. Sometimes out here we do try to do as much mop up as we can to put the fire out so it's not smoking all night, being in a residential setting here. And sometimes wood is very difficult to put out, and sometimes those can reignite. But once the leaf litter is burned here, there's really not much fuel or any fuel left for it to reignite at all. Yes, Joe?
I have a area about 150 feet by 150 feet to burn. Would you recommend cutting a couple breaks through the middle of that just to break it up a little bit and burn part of it at a time?
Well, I mean, what's your goal for burning that off? Are you just trying to get it
Just trying to get it
cleaned
cleaned up.
up and-
Yeah, they mow part of my lot,
Sure.
but this part, apparently a machine got stuck out there one time.
Oh,
And there's a big rut out there, and they don't wanna go out there
springy or
anymore.
something? Yeah.
And I just wanna clean it all off.
No, I wouldn't cut a
Just-
break through an additional break or anything.
Because I've got a
Just-
break on one side, I got a trail on the back, and I got my
Yep.
lawn on the other side.
Mhm.
Just let it go.
Yeah, certainly in a burn that small, I mean, you could just get away with doing that back burn the whole
Yeah.
length of that, just to really try to maintain that control there.
Okay.
But yeah, you wouldn't have to cut anything additional through the middle. That would just give you something else to have to worry about
Yeah.
maintaining things. So.
Okay.
Yes,
The
Mike?
chief financial officer is forbidden me to buy some of this fire equipment. Where you can rent some of this equipment. I mean, you see my back, I don't have a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, being upslope towards the house, if it escaped and, I want to control it really well.
Yeah, you mean like rent the equipment from the association or something? Or, I mean,
Yeah,
I don't think there's
association or-
anywhere to rent this type of equipment, but I would certainly, I have extra equipment that I'd be able to loan someone if I didn't need it on a particular
Like a
day.
propane torch, one of the things you get at Home Depot, you
Is,
use that?
for ignition?
Yeah.
No, we use a drip torch, so that's what's pictured here. You can use a propane torch, I mean, that certainly worked, and, actually at home, we have a pretty small area that we burn, and we use one of those little propane, like a camping canister that has a long wand on it,
Yeah.
and that's what we use to light that. For larger scale burns, we use these drip torches, and you put in a mix of, gasoline and diesel, so it's about 75 to 80% diesel, and then 20 to 25% gasoline. And that has a wick on the end, and then when you tip it, your fuel slowly drips out of there, and then that's what lights their vegetation on fire. But yeah, I mean, a propane torch would be acceptable for smaller scale use. Yes, Mary?
So I think we're comfortable doing a small burn, because we've actually seen you and Corey do it, so.
Mhm.
But, for a large burn,
I mean, is there anybody in the area that would be able to, are there any resources for a larger burn for someone to come out? I know Corey and you are very, busy,
Mhm.
overwhelmed, so, I mean, if you have any resources like that.
Yeah, I actually, I did make a handout last night. So the JoDaviess Conservation Foundation started a stewardship cooperative in the last couple of years, and they do prescribed burns for hire for people.
Okay.
And then there's a company I think they're out of Milledgeville, Illinois, which is down in Carroll County, but still relatively local. Midwest Forestry Unlimited, and they can do burns. And then there are a couple of larger scale restoration companies out of like southern Wisconsin that will come out to the area
Okay.
and do some burns. So that's a question I'm asked pretty frequently, is who can do a burn for me. There are a couple landscapers out here who will do some small scale burns, but I don't trust them to do something bigger, because I don't think they have that experience.
Is there a process for that out here? Seems like there's a process for everything. Like a form or something.
For doing burns or
Yeah.
anything? No, we just ask that if you do a burn on your property that you notify security,
Okay.
so that they know what's happening. If they get a call from someone, or, and then, again, depending on your scale, notify the sheriff's department as well, because if someone calls in a burn,
Right.
if someone not on the burn unit calls in that burn, then they have to dispatch the fire department to check it out, unless they know that what you're doing is intentional and being done on purpose and things. So
It also helps when it goes sideways.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, so they know where and how to respond quickly. And luckily, we have a really great relationship here in the association with the fire department. And in the past, they have come out on burns with us before. A couple years ago, I accidentally set a big cottonwood tree on fire right on the edge of a burn unit on Wachter and Broderick, and I've since had the tree cut down, but it was dying, and so the fire got up under the bark and kept burning. And I didn't call 911. I know the guys, so I just called and I'm like, hey, could you bring your brush truck out and help me put a little extra water on this tree? And they were nice enough to do that without a big to-do with a call to the fire station. That wasn't necessarily that hazardous. It was just something we didn't want. Wasn't an escape fire. It was just a tree on fire. So, but yeah, no, just to answer your question, Sarah, it'd just be to notify security if you're planning on doing something like that. Similar if you light a brush pile or something, just so they know why there's smoke coming from a
And
certain
then
area.
also, what about like expertise on your particular lot? Is that supposed to be evaluated just in terms of, it's not a priority, it's more like the burn that was done on the green space, just to clear out the.
No, there's no,
Okay.
we don't have to register
Yeah.
with the association if you wanna do a burn or anything. I'm certainly happy to consult if you have questions about properly creating burn breaks, or, if you're interested in something like that, potentially the next time we burn that woodland adjacent to you,
Yes.
We could burn into your property a little bit. 'Cause that's a lot easier to use your backyard as a fire break than to cut one along a property line. So, that's certainly something that the association has worked together with people before to do that.
Thanks.
Yes.
So, I had violated all your rules. Here to testify. We had the wind turn.
Mhm.
It was terrifying.
Yeah.
It was utterly terrifying. So my question really is, roughly, rule of thumb, what does it cost to hire one of these guys to do a burn? Rule of thumb, just relatively flat.
It depends on their insurance, really. No, seriously,
Yeah.
burning, it's really expensive. Lots of people have issues with it, and the insurance is the one that's
Yeah,
if
yeah.
something goes sideways, so it depends on who they've got carrying them, so. Call, email, that's the best solution.
Yeah, I
So
did,
there's no rule of thumb to,
I wouldn't be comfortable giving that out personally, so.
Okay.
yeah, I did talk to, a contractor yesterday, and he said he charges $500 for burns that are smaller than 5 acres, which is, to me, extremely cheap. When I was working for a contractor, I think our minimum starting price for a burn was about $2,000 an acre. But, you know, like, and I'm sorry, you're really familiar.
No, I'm a forest manager on the Iowa side.
Oh, okay.
I'm just here to talk to you after this.
Oh, okay, great, yeah, I think, have you come to a couple presentations or
Nope.
JDCS stuff? No, you look awfully familiar. So anyways, as he can attest to, you know, it really depends on, you know, bigger contractors will have a higher overhead and cost and insurance for, you know, doing burns like that. So,
okay.
yeah, unfortunately, I can't give you just a rule of thumb on that. I do know, like, unless, you know, most of these companies, they fill up their burn schedules fill up pretty quickly, so if it's something you're interested, fall burns are, you know, out of the question for this year, because all these places are, you know, have their contracting hours spoken for. But, you know, it'd be a good time to call now to get on a list for spring burn season. So you always want to be looking at least a season or two ahead, you know, to try to get on someone's list if you're interested in hiring someone for
For
that.
everything.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
More for the purpose of the burns. I have a neighbor a little bit down who seems like they're burning every year or every 2 years. Is that more for like persistent weeds or because, you know, we like the way it looks or? Because they have a fairly large lot and they burn often. And I just found that interesting because I feel like, you know, if the purpose is just to rejuvenate for 1 year, is it, you know, what would be the benefit of doing it more and more often?
So early on in, like, when we're just starting to establish prairies, we typically burn annually just to help reduce some weed competition. Then as things become more and more established, we get on bigger rotation intervals, so like 3 to 5 years typically for prairies. Woodlands would be maybe a little bit longer than that. But for some people, it really, you know, I know some landowners, they just like the clean look of a burn, and instead of looking at that last year's growth or the last 2 years' growth of stems and stuff, they just really like that clean look. So it's kind of, some of that is, you know, landowner preference as well, yeah.
My 2 cents too, if you don't mind me adding.
No.
We burn woodland annually right now because we're trying to knock down all of the sugar maple to get oak trees to grow.
Right.
So I did the math, and with my crew in this property, I can do 1 application of fire every year for 7 years, the same cost as doing all the invasive work for the same amount. And it's more fun. So that's the other thing too. Exactly.
It is fun to watch. I
No,
mean,
yeah.
So popcorn, it's great.
Yeah.
But, you know, I kind of thought it was maybe for more persistent, but it is just it's a, you know, fair, he just said it was for their persistency. Yeah.
Yeah, so not
But I mean, the
backward, yeah.
persistent, you know, weeds or
Yeah.
insects or whatever.
Well, yeah, and, you know, again, you know, with the woodland burns
Yeah.
too, with, you know, garlic mustard, doing annual burns like that, you continue to reduce the amount of plants that are there to be able to set seed for that following year. So those more regular burns or annual burns like that can help knock stuff like that back.
The poison parsnip, would a burn in a certain area help that, or is it better just to try to eradicate it by hand if you can? Yeah, I'm talking an area maybe 50 feet at the most by 10, and you know, you could probably work that by hand rather than burning it.
Yeah, I mean, it is fire sensitive, but it also depends on how thick it is. So, you know, this time of year and in the spring, they have the big flat green basil rosettes of leaves. And so that's not gonna carry a fire through. So it depends on what kind of vegetation that you have growing around it. If the fire can get hot enough to affect that. I think, you know, doing a broadleaf application this time of year or very early in the spring, I found to be, herbicide application,
Right.
I found to be really effective to help control some of those cool season rosettes like that.
And that's a poison parsnip.
Yeah.
Something else to add that I found really cool, the prairie partners, or prairie enthusiasts in Wisconsin, have you seen the parsnip predator?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
we have those.
okay.
What's
We have
that?
two of them.
It-
I know we're.
Oh, yeah, it's awesome. So just Google prairie enthusiast parsnip predator, they're like $40, you pick it up in Baroka, Wisconsin, it's a joy, I cleared like an acre in the middle of summer, and it was fun.
Parsnip.
Parsnip predator from the prairie enthusiast. Yeah, it's trouble.
Yeah, it's a specialized shovel that they cut down so it has like a notch in it. So if you cut the root of that parsnip or, you know, any taprooted species really, some of the dandelion, thistles, some of our taprooted thistles.
Green Slate.
Yeah. If you cut that below the ground surface and then pull the plant up, that kills the plant and won't allow it to go to seed. So, but if you're working with parsnip, of course, the potential for getting the sap on your skin and getting burned, you know, long sleeves, gloves, the whole.
So early spring will be a good time to take care of that, right?
Yeah. If you're using the parsnip predator, the best time for that is actually after the plant is flowered, because then you don't have to bend over as much. So, you know, you can cut the shovel's nice because you don't have to bend. You can just stand there and cut that and pull the plant out of the ground.
Unfortunately, it's the hottest part of the summer.
Right.
Yeah,
it flowers in
Blows on.
late June and July.
One
Yeah.
more. So after the burn, because some people just burn, but we like to seed after we burn to put the good plants back. I don't know if everyone does that, but I think Prairie Moon Nursery or Prairie Nursery on their website has what to do, and it's really thorough. So I try to follow that. You know,
For overseeding or
for burning and
burning and stuff?
overseeding,
Yeah,
and
they
what
do
to
have.
do and how
Yep.
many years. So you know.
Yeah, Prairie Moon Nursery is a really great resource
Mhm.
for that type of. They do have instructions for, you know, doing prescribed burns as well as the best time for seeding and methods and things like that.
And they have 10% off on their seed mixes right now.
Oh.
But wait until about 3 o'clock today before you order.
And what is that place called?
Prairie Moon Nursery. That's in. They're in Winona, Minnesota.
Do you have a question?
Yeah. What about hibernating animals? Does this impact them?
No, if they're, you know, burrowed under the ground, then the soil doesn't get hot enough to affect anything that's underground. A few spring burns that we've done, we have hit rabbit nests and stuff when we've done burns, and that's always sad, but you know, it's just, you know, a little bit of collateral damage that comes with some of this. But it goes to timing again too. I mean, if you do fall burn or winter, if you've got the right conditions and no snow cover, really early spring before those animals are active, then you can avoid a lot of collateral damage like that. So.
What about burning in the winter?
It's possible if there's no snow cover and you have the right conditions. It's a little bit more challenging just with how cold it is. So, you know, if you have like a mild January day, and you know, your prescription or the weather's right with humidity and things like that, then it is possible to burn in the winter.
Is it any safer because of the frozen ground?
Not really. I mean, it's a great time to burn brush piles in the winter when there is snow cover, so that you don't affect anything else, or the fire doesn't get away from you. You know, if I get questions from people about burning brush piles, I always say, don't burn during burn season, because you know it can spread to adjacent flammable vegetation and stuff. But.
So, one last thing, if you are interested in knowing more about wild ones or are interested in more speakers and you'd like to make suggestions, just take one of my cards and email me and I'll keep you on my list. I think that's all I wanted to say. And thank you, Emily.
Yeah,
That
thank
was
you.
very interesting.